and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Rail Program Delivery video series. I'm Anthony Thomas, and I'm pleased to introduce Michael Johnson, Supervisory Environmental Protection Specialist with the FRA.
Hello, everyone.
In this video, we'll cover environmental review, a critical element of the rail capital project development process. The components of the environmental review process are based on the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, which requires federal actions to be considered for their potential impacts on the environment. Environmental impacts, both positive and negative, are those that are ecological, aesthetic, historical, cultural, economic, social, or health-related.
The impacts assessed as part of environmental review can be categorized in one of three ways. There are direct impacts, which occur at the same time and place as the action itself. Indirect impacts, which occur later in time or physically far from the action, and cumulative impacts, which occur when the consequences of the action are added to other past, present, or reasonably foreseeable future actions.
From the NEPA legislation came the NEPA process, which aims to assess and clearly disclose the environmental impacts of federal actions to both decision makers and the public at large. The NEPA process works as an umbrella process under which other laws, statutes, executive orders, and other requirements are applied. This includes Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act, and environmental justice. The environmental review process is closely aligned with the service planning and preliminary engineering phases of rail development. We'll talk more about this later.
The NEPA process does not impose predefined limits on allowable environmental impacts. Instead, decision makers must take the information from the NEPA process and make an informed decision about how to advance the project. It is vital that decision makers integrate the NEPA process with other project development processes.
Before we get into the environmental review requirements, let's first explain the various classes of action. FRA projects are categorized into one of three NEPA classes of action. Each class has different requirements for analytical documentation, procedural requirements, and obligations for the decision document that results at the end of the process. The first category is categorical exclusions, or CEs.
There are times when a federal agency can know at the outset that a project will have no significant environmental impacts. This happens when projects fall into one or more categories that the agency has previously found to have no significant individual or cumulative effects on the environment. These are documented as CEs. Examples of CE projects would be the maintenance of existing railroad equipment, tracks and bridges, or communications and signaling equipment. Instead of documenting the environmental analysis and crafting a decision document, a CE project requires documentation via the FRA Categorical Exclusion Worksheet to document that there are no significant impacts.
The second NEPA category is the environmental assessment, or EA. EAs apply to projects when decision makers are uncertain whether their project will create significant environmental impacts that cannot be avoided, minimized, or mitigated.
In preparing an EA, decision makers analyze an impact's significance by the context and intensity of the specific project. Significance can vary between agencies and perspectives. The EA includes a description of potential environmental impacts and whether any of those would constitute significant impacts. If the project would not create significant environmental impacts, the federal agency issues a Finding of No Significant Impact, or a FONSI. If the work would create significant environmental impacts, or if the EA does not properly document anticipated impacts, a FONSI cannot be issued and an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, must be prepared.
This brings us to the final category, the EIS. The EIS applies to projects that will or are likely to result in significant environmental impacts.
The EIS is used as a basis for a federal agency to issue a Record of Decision, or ROD, which identifies the alternative that has been selected to be pursued, the rationale for selecting that alternative, the anticipated environmental impacts, and the measures that will be taken to mitigate those environmental impacts.
Now we're going to get into the details of what is entailed when you're developing an EIS for your project. Development of an EIS incorporates consideration of the potential environmental impacts and benefits into the federal decision-making process by examining a range of feasible alternatives, analyzing the potential environmental impacts of each alternative, and identifying potential means of mitigating those impacts.
The EIS enables a transparent, thorough assessment of project impacts before decisions are made to pursue one alternative. This process provides opportunities for the public and stakeholders to review the results of the analysis and to provide comments for decision makers to consider.
The 5 elements of an EIS are purpose and need, scoping, agency coordination and public involvement, identification of reasonable alternatives, environmental analysis, and selecting a preferred alternative. We will now go through each of these elements step by step. First is purpose and need. The purpose and need statement should reflect the project's fundamental goals and objectives, and it should identify the needs that the proposed project will remedy.
The purpose and need statement serves as the primary criterion for identifying and evaluating alternatives. It answers the question, does this alternative address the need and achieve the objective? The purpose and need statement should be as concise and understandable as possible, focusing on the primary transportation challenges to be addressed. The purpose and need statement serves as the cornerstone for the alternatives analysis, but should not discuss specific alternatives. It should answer vital questions such as where and what the problem is that needs addressing.
Next comes scoping, agency coordination, and public involvement. This is a prevailing element that occurs throughout all of the subsequent steps. During scoping, you will determine what the project will entail, identifying specific significant issues or areas of concern, and identifying potential alternatives. The scope of the project is shaped through developing the purpose and need.
The preparation of an EIS will be preceded by a formal Notice of Intent, or NOI, published in the Federal Register to notify public and government agencies that FRA will soon begin preparation of an EIS and that it is soliciting scoping input. Simultaneously, FRA must initiate contact and coordination with government agencies which may have jurisdiction over elements impacted by the project so that their input may be considered. Government-to-government consultation with tribal governments is also initiated during scoping at the beginning of the project.
Additional laws and requirements covered by the NEPA process may require subsequent outreach. It is important for project leaders to also reach out to participating agencies, groups, or organizations that may have an interest in the project.
Public involvement should begin at the onset of scoping and be spelled out in a formal public involvement plan.
Next comes the identification of reasonable alternatives. Reasonable alternatives are those that are deemed practical or feasible due to their constructability, cost, or limited environmental impacts.
If preliminary analysis shows that an alternative does not meet the purpose and need, or is not practical for constructability, cost, or environmental reasons, the alternative may be deemed unreasonable and dismissed with supporting justification. What accounts for reasonableness? The no-action alternative provides the baseline for comparing the action alternatives. Information gathered from scoping sessions informs the purpose and need, which reflects the project's goals and will be used to determine if an alternative is reasonable.
All reasonable alternatives advance to the next step, environmental analysis. During environmental analysis, you'll determine the expected impacts that each reasonable alternative would have on the environment. The number of alternatives to be analyzed depends on the complexity of your project. Expected impacts that are weighed are related to the effects on the community, project design characteristics, service routing, station location, construction, and ridership, among a host of others.
Environmental analysis should address any potential effects on the human and natural environment, such as air, water, endangered species, historic places, transportation, the surrounding community, or parkland. FRA guidance will specify your list of environmental resources to adhere by, which may include impacts which require specific consideration for your project. Check the FRA website for current environmental analysis guidance. In addition to identifying the impacts, you'll also identify mitigation strategies to avoid or reduce the significant impacts that each alternative may have. Mitigation could bring the impact below a certain level of significance. Alternatives should also be concurrently evaluated for the projected cost, scheduling, safety, and project delivery.
Once you've completed environmental analysis on all reasonable alternatives, FRA will use the information you develop to select a preferred alternative.
The grantee may propose a preferred alternative, but ultimately FRA makes the final decision as to which alternative is best suited to move forward. To do this, FRA conducts an alternative screening process to compare the impacts of alternatives to the no-action alternative. Factors such as environmental impacts, cost, ridership, and other impacts and benefits are weighed. It's important to note that the most environmentally sensitive alternative, that is, the one with the fewest environmental impacts, is not always chosen as the preferred alternative.
After working through the NEPA process, grantees typically draft the EIS, which encompasses all of the elements discussed earlier, including The purpose and need statement, a description of all reasonable alternatives as well as the no action alternative, the process to define the alternatives, and any alternatives that were found unreasonable and not carried to detailed analysis. A description of the environment potentially affected, the extent of environmental impacts including direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, short-term and long-term impacts, and the context of the impacts, a summary of mitigation measures to minimize identified impacts, and a summary of the unavoidable adverse impacts. Documentation of agency coordination and public involvement, including any scoping feedback, and a discussion of permits and any related environmental processes required to implement each alternative.
Please note that errors in carrying out the NEPA process can result in legal action alleging improper use or misuse of the NEPA statute and its related laws and regulations, so conduct this process carefully. Major errors that are often litigated include a lack of public involvement and omission of an alternative before it is properly vetted as a potential alternative.
The NEPA process provides the flexibility to assess projects in a staged approach, known as tiering. Tier 1 addresses broad programs and issues in a programmatic level of analysis, and Tier 2 analyzes site-specific, project-level impacts in subsequent studies. Tiering is helpful for rail projects as rail corridors often encompass many jurisdictions and cover large geographic areas. Applying NEPA to service-related decisions is known as Tier 1 NEPA, or Service NEPA. Resources that will be impacted along the corridor should be identified, but specific impacts do not have to be identified. Service NEPA closely aligns with the service planning process. It is not required for all projects, but is generally used for large-scale initiatives that have multiple components with independent utility.
The Tier 1 document identifies an area of impact along a particular corridor and identifies specific resources that could be affected along that corridor. However, FRA does not make determinations about specific impacts to those resources. That takes place in Tier 2 NEPA analysis.
Applying NEPA to project-specific, design-related decisions is known as Tier 2 NEPA, or Project NEPA. Project NEPA closely aligns with the preliminary engineering process. It is a requirement for all rail capital projects funded by FRA in order to advance to final design and construction.
Specific impacts to resources must be identified as part of Tier 2 NEPA analysis. Consultations, approvals, determinations, agreements, and permits should also be addressed as part of the Tier 2 documentation process. Tier 2 NEPA culminates in a design alternative before advancing to final design and construction. The primary benefit of tiering is to allow programmatic decisions to be made. For example, a Tier 1 NEPA process might help determine the market served, ridership, and the level of service for a set of related projects. You would then follow up this Tier 1 analysis with Tier 2 analysis to make project-level decisions, such as specific routing alignments. Ultimately, FRA makes the decision whether or not to pursue a tiered approach.
With NEPA being a critical component of rail capital project development, it's important to know the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved.
FRA is legally responsible for overseeing and ensuring the integrity of the NEPA process for rail projects financed, funded, or otherwise approved by FRA. FRA grantees and loan recipients may assist in preparing NEPA documents under FRA oversight, but FRA ultimately accepts and owns the document. FRA must serve as lead or co-lead agency for projects seeking FRA financial assistance. Federal, state, and local agencies with jurisdiction by law or special interests relative to a project may serve as cooperating agencies or participating agencies. Lead agencies should give serious consideration to the concerns of these agencies.
So what is the grantee or loan recipient's role in environmental review?
All project sponsors receiving federal funds should be involved in the NEPA process, particularly in public outreach. Their main responsibilities include the development of the NEPA document. Since FRA must serve as lead or co-lead agency for projects with FRA funding, grantees should work in close consultation with FRA.
There's a lot of detail involved during the environmental review process. Let's take a moment to review some of it by going through a quick quiz. Question 1. True or false? Providing a certain number of trips per day is a goal that grantees could identify as the purpose of the purpose and need statement.
False. The number of trips per day would be identified in a particular alternative and would not be included in the purpose and need statement. A project's purpose would be broader in its objective, such as reducing congestion on highways or serving an underserved market.
Question 2. Assuming a tiered approach, categorize the following by whether they would generally fall under Tier 1 or Tier 2 NEPA: identification of affected resources, specific routes, corridor route alternatives, cost estimating, developing agreements, ridership and level of service.
Tier 1 NEPA focuses on the stages of planning and concept design, which would include the identification of resources, the selection of corridor route alternatives, and the ridership and levels of service. Tier 2 NEPA is concerned with details vital to preliminary engineering. This includes narrowing down the corridor route alternatives to specific routes and developing the relevant draft agreements. It's also important to recognize that tiering is not always black and white. There are processes that apply to both Tier 1 and Tier 2 NEPA. Cost estimating, which occurs at both the conceptual and developmental levels, is one such example.
Question 3. On an FRA-funded rail project, who selects the preferred alternative? The grantee, the contractor, the FRA, or the host railroad?
That role belongs to the FRA. FRA is legally responsible for overseeing and ensuring the integrity of the NEPA process for all rail projects financed, funded, or otherwise approved by FRA. Environmental review is a critical step in the rail capital project development process. Through environmental review, you'll weigh the potential impacts of project alternatives, coordinate public involvement, and improve planning and design. By conducting a thorough NEPA process, decision makers are afforded better information to make rail investments.
For more information, please visit the following web pages. Thank you.